Hello everyone, I am Shashwat Sanyal from Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, Bangkok. I am based in the Risk Governance Department and I have been working on this local disaster resilience framework for Republic of Korea. So for further information on the framework, you can easily reach out to me at my email, which is saswata.s@adpc.net. Before we start this session, I would like to just talk about a few things which I believe Mr. Israel Hegelos has already discussed in the preceding two sessions. So, why do we need a framework? The framework is basically aimed at giving an overall reflection of disaster resilience in a particular locality in Republic of Korea. And it is also to comprehend the amount of uh, progress that has happened vis-a-vis the different dimensions under the framework. So there are four different dimensions under the framework. The first one is understanding local hazards, exposures, and vulnerabilities. The second one is about plans and procedures for disaster safety and management in a particular locality. The third one is about local capacities and resources. And the fourth one is about local engagement and network. So we believe that after reviewing the different policies and documents on Republic of Korea and from other countries like USA, Australia, that these are some of the dimensions that are very important for local level disaster resilience. And that is the reason why we developed these four key dimensions. And the second objective to use this framework is to also comprehend and understand which particular dimension a particular locality is lagging behind. So let's go ahead and understand what are the learning objectives of this session. First is to understand and discuss the different uses of the framework. So as I've already explained, these are the objectives of the framework, and it can be used by different localities in Republic of Korea to basically understand and get an overview of disaster resilience in a particular locality vis-a-vis these four dimensions. And the second one is to practice the use of framework. So this is an Excel based tool. So anyone who knows how to use Excel can easily use it because mostly the responses are yes and no. And an auto-generated specific and overall recommendation would be given based upon your inputs. So let's go and understand what are the use of the framework and why and how we can use it. So LDRF, the Local Disaster Resilience Framework, is a functional framework, and as I mentioned, is an Excel-based tool. It helps in checking needs and gaps with regards to that particular locality and their preparedness for disasters. And then it can also help us in designing activities and initiatives based upon the overall and specific recommendations that I talked about a little earlier. And then track progress. It can also use as a monitoring tool. So from time to time, on a regular basis, this tool can be used to check the progress vis-a-vis the four different dimensions. So we do have a target score for each of the dimension and achieved score. So with regards to the target score, we can actually check how much are we achieving year by year or in a time-to-time basis on regular intervals. So one other thing that I would like to mention is that this framework is an adaptable framework. So it can be adapted based upon the realities and context of your particular locality. Some of the specific recommendations and the overall recommendations can also be adapted going forward. So it's a very flexible tool that can be adapted further for your locality. Now we will go into understanding how to use the Excel-based tool. So we will meet on the other side when we have the Excel sheet on screen. Thank you. Welcome back everyone. We again meet on the other side and now we have the Excel sheet in front of us. This is the Excel-based tool I was talking about and referring to earlier. This is the Excel-based tool which discusses and helps you find out the local disaster resilience in your particular locality. So on the very top, you can look at the general instructions. So I would suggest that please go through all the general instructions before you proceed. So the first instruction is to fill up box 1. Box 1 talks about the general information of who is filling the information in this particular sheet, which locality do they belong to, which province do they belong to, and the date when they are actually inputting. It is very important for us to understand that we do not fill any other information in any of the other boxes in this sheet. As we go down, we can see that there are two other boxes, box 2 and box 3. Box 2 generates the overall recommendation based upon your inputs in the sheets D1, D2, D3, and D4. So the sheets D1, D2, D3, and D4 are the sheets where you put inputs with regards to the 4 dimensions we talked about earlier. And lastly, the box 3 talks about the different scores. So that you can see on the top, there are target scores for each dimension, and then there are achieved scores for each dimension. And there is an overall target score, and then there is an overall achieved score. As soon as you fill in your inputs in the sheets D1, D2, D3, and D4, corresponding to the 4 dimensions we talked about earlier, these 2 boxes will be auto-generated, and you will get an overall understanding where your locality lies vis-a-vis the different checklist items under these 4 dimensions. So let's now go to dimension 1 and look at the different checklist items under dimension 1. So we can see here that under dimension 1, we have 6 checklist items. So on the very top, we have whether there is disaster risk assessment for safety diagnosis in a particular locality, and then there are other related checklist items. So the checklist items are divided into 2 priority objectives, as was discussed earlier by Mr. Israel Hagelos. So the priority objectives for checklist item A1, A2, and A3 is comprehensive natural hazard induced risk assessment is undertaken regularly for each locality to produce local natural hazard induced disaster profile. This is a very important part of understanding local disaster resilience for a particular locality, because if we do not understand the risk profile of a particular locality, it's very difficult to plan for local disaster resilience. The second priority objective here, which involves 3 checklist items, is natural hazard monitoring, forecasting, early warning. So this is also very important because from time to time, there will be natural hazards that affect our localities. So there needs to be a monitoring setup that kind of helps us understand what kind of natural hazards are impending on our locality. So you can see here, this is the only column, column E, that you have to fill in. So there are 2 responses, yes and no. If you choose yes response, there will be no specific recommendations. So for each of the checklist items, based upon your response of yes and no, a specific recommendation would be auto-generated. For example, if you select yes, then there will be no specific recommendations, as there is the current setup is already good enough. However, if you select no, then there will be a specific recommendation that is auto-generated here. Similarly, let's try for the other checklist items as well. As you can see, as soon as we provide our inputs in yes and no, the specific recommendations are getting auto-generated. And what this does, if you look at this box, it also generates the achieved score vis-a-vis the target score, and also talks about the overall recommendation for this particular dimension. And in the bottom, in this yellow box, basically what we talk about are the conditions of reaching this overall recommendation. So there are a couple of conditions for reaching this overall recommendations. I'll just go through the first one, which is if checklist item A1, A2, and A3 do not exist, or the total score is less than 6, then we have to consider policy changes to make assessment of natural hazard induced disaster risk more comprehensive and early warning information more understandable and usable. So like this, you will auto-generate overall and specific recommendations based upon your inputs for each of the dimensions. You can please go ahead and try for dimension 2, dimension 3, dimension 4. And then once you complete filling up your responses, you can go back to the first sheet. So once you're done with filling up of all the inputs under the sheets D1, D2, D3, and D4, which correspond to dimension 1, which was understanding natural hazards, exposure and vulnerability. Dimension 2, where the checklist items mostly talk about planning procedures for disaster safety and management. D3, which talks about local capacities and resources. And D4, where the checklist items enlist um, items that talk about local engagement and network. You will get an overall recommendation that is summarized here. So as you can see, the overall recommendation will change based upon the inputs that you provide in the individual sheets, and also you will get target scores. Since we have only filled up dimension 1, you can see the target score is 6, and we have achieved 3 out of the 6. And similarly, the overall target score is 41, and we have achieved 3. And once we fill up dimension 2, 3, and 4, then we will get an overall achieved vis-a-vis target score. And this can actually help us to understand under which dimension we need to arrange for certain specific projects which can enhance that particular dimension. With that, I would like to say thank you. Please do fill in your inputs under sheets D2, D3, and D4, and then come back and check the overall recommendations and the achieved vis-a-vis the target scores. Thanks a lot.